Story 1. The house on Millhaven Road. The night nurse who found her said that Petra Voss was sitting perfectly upright in bed, eyes open, hands folded in her lap, with a look on her face that was not fear and was not pain. It was something worse. It was understanding, like she had finally, after 3 years of not knowing, been told the answer to the question that had been eating her alive from the inside, and the answer was every bit as terrible as she had always suspected. The thing is, Petra Voss had not told anyone about the question. Not her daughter, not her therapist, not the detective who had visited her twice in the months after she moved out of the house on Millhaven Road. She had carried it alone, the way people carry things they believe no one else could possibly survive knowing. Let me take you back to the beginning. Petra Voss was 41 years old in March of 2019. She was a high school English teacher in Chalmette, Louisiana, a small city just southeast of New Orleans, sandwiched between the Mississippi River and Lake Bourne, a place where the humidity clings to you like something alive, and the old houses have a way of keeping secrets that newer places simply cannot. She had lived in Chalmette her whole life. She knew her neighbors by name, knew the streets by feel, knew which intersections flooded after a heavy rain and which corner stores stayed open past midnight. She was, by every ordinary measure, a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had one daughter, Camille. 19 years old that spring, away at LSU studying nursing, which Petra was proud of in a way that sometimes embarrassed her because she couldn't help mentioning it. She had no husband. Camille's father had left when Camille was 3, and Petra had long since made peace with that, or at least made a version of peace that was close enough to the real thing that it didn't cause her any visible pain. She had owned the house on Millhaven Road for 11 years, a 2-story craftsman-style house with a covered porch and a narrow backyard that backed up against a chain-link fence and a drainage canal. The house had character, which is another way of saying it had a history, and not all of that history was the kind anyone had bothered to write down. The first thing that happened, the first crack as Petra later described it, occurred on a Wednesday evening in late March. She had come home from school, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table to grade essays. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt normal, unremarkable, the default state of a home that is occupied by exactly one person. She was 2 essays deep when she heard it. A sound from upstairs. Not a thump, not a footstep, something more subtle than either of those things. A slow, deliberate creak. The kind of creak that comes from weight shifting on old wooden floorboards. The kind that has a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. She sat still for a moment. She told herself it was the house settling, the way old houses do, contracting against the cool of the evening. She told herself this because it was a reasonable explanation, and because the alternative, that someone or something was moving around in the room directly above her head, was not something she was prepared to entertain on a Wednesday evening when she still had 22 essays left to grade. She went back to the essays. The creaking stopped. She finished her tea. She graded until 10 o'clock. She went upstairs and checked every room, as she later admitted she always did, as any person living alone in a 2-story house will often do regardless of whether they've heard anything unusual, because living alone trains you toward a specific kind of vigilance that you don't always notice until someone else points it out. Every room was empty. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. She went to bed. 3 nights later, it happened again. Same time, same sound. The same slow, weighted creak from the room directly above the kitchen, which was the guest bedroom. A room Petra used for storage. Camille's old boxes, holiday decorations, a broken elliptical machine she'd been meaning to get rid of for 2 years. She did what she'd done before. She told herself it was nothing. She went to bed. On the 4th occurrence, she went upstairs while the sound was still happening. The creaking stopped the moment she put her foot on the first step. She opened the guest bedroom door and stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the boxes, the decorations, the elliptical machine, the dust motes suspended in the slant of light from the hallway. Nothing out of place, nothing moved. The room smelled like cardboard and old plastic, and the faintly sweet chemical scent of whatever had leaked from one of Camille's craft boxes years ago. She was about to close the door when she noticed the window that faced the backyard, the window she always kept locked because the lock was old and the latch had never sat right, and she'd always worried about it as a security issue. That window was not locked. It was not open, but the latch was turned to the unlatched position, and when she crossed the room and pushed on the frame, the window swung outward on its hinges with no resistance at all. She stood at the open window and looked down at the narrow backyard below, the drainage canal, the chain-link fence, the dark line of trees beyond it. There was nothing there, no movement, no figure retreating into the dark, but there was a single footprint in the soft earth directly below the window. A large footprint, pressed deep, as though someone had landed from height and walked no further. Just the one print. Petra stood at that window for a very long time. She is not, by her own description, a person who panics easily. She is methodical, careful, a person who grades essays and checks rooms at night and keeps lists. So what she did next was characteristic of exactly that personality. She took a photograph of the footprint. She closed and latched the window. She went downstairs and called the non-emergency police line to report what she had found, describing it not as a break-in, but as a suspicious circumstance that she wanted on record. An officer came the following afternoon. He looked at the window, confirmed the latch was functional but loose, suggested she have a locksmith reinforce it, took a statement, and noted the incident in a report. He found nothing else unusual. He told her, not unkindly, that the footprint could have belonged to anyone, a neighborhood kid who'd wandered through, someone cutting through between properties. Petra thanked him and let him believe she found that explanation satisfying. She did not find it satisfying. Because here is the thing about that footprint that she did not mention to the officer, and that she did not mention to anyone for a long time after. The footprint faced the wrong way, not walking toward the house, not retreating from it. The toe of the print was aimed at the back fence. Whoever had made that print had been standing below the window, and they had been facing away from the house, as if they'd been watching the canal, or watching whatever was in the dark beyond the canal, or waiting for something to come from that direction. Petra had told the officer where the footprint was, but she hadn't told him which way it was oriented. Later, she couldn't explain why she held that back, only that it felt, somehow, like information that belonged to her, like knowing it was the only thing still giving her any sense of control. The spring passed uneasily. Petra had the locksmith reinforce all the downstairs windows and the guest bedroom window. She bought a doorbell camera and a motion-activated floodlight for the backyard. She called Camille more often, without explaining why. Camille called her perceptive for sensing she was stressed. Petra didn't correct her. In June, the next thing happened, and it was worse. She came home from school on a Friday afternoon to find her back door unlocked. The reinforced lock, the one she had paid a professional to install, was open. Not broken. Not forced. Simply unlocked, as though by a key she had not given anyone. She did not go inside. She stood on the back porch and called 911. 2 officers arrived within 12 minutes. They cleared the house, room by room, and found no one inside. They found no evidence of forced entry. They found in the guest bedroom, the room above the kitchen, the room with the window, a single thing that had not been there when Petra left for school that morning. On the floor in the center of the room, placed deliberately in the clear space between the storage boxes, was a glass of water. A drinking glass from Petra's kitchen, filled to the brim, sitting perfectly still, without a single drop spilled. One of the officers, a young woman named Deputy Soraya Fontenot, later said that the glass of water was the most unsettling thing she had encountered in 3 years of patrol work. Not because a glass of water is dangerous, but because of what it implied. Someone had taken the time to fill a glass, carry it upstairs without spilling, and set it down in the center of a room. That was not the behavior of a burglar. That was not the behavior of a trespasser grabbing what they could and getting out. It was the behavior of someone who intended to stay, someone who was making themselves comfortable. "Do you have any idea who might have access to this house?" Deputy Fontenot asked. Petra said no, then paused, then said, "There was a man, about 4 years ago, a handyman I hired to fix the water heater. He made a copy of my key. I changed the locks after I realized, but do you have his name?" She did. She had kept the invoice. His name was Dale Murchison, 47, of Arabi, Louisiana, a solo contractor she'd found on a neighborhood app. He'd done the job without incident, been professional, been unremarkable in every way. She'd only found out about the key copy because a neighbor mentioned seeing a man on her porch when she wasn't home. And when Petra had confronted Dale about it, he hadn't denied it. He'd said he kept copies of clients' keys for emergency purposes. She had called a locksmith that same day. Deputy Fontenot ran the name. Dale Murchison had 2 prior restraining orders filed against him in the previous decade, both from women who had hired him as a contractor. Neither had resulted in criminal charges. He had no current address on file that matched Arabi. His last known vehicle registration had lapsed 18 months earlier. The case was referred to Detective Armand Touraud of the St. Bernard Parish Sheriff's Office. Touraud was a methodical, quiet man who had been working property crimes and stalking cases for 11 years. He told Petra that in his experience, cases like this, the careful placement, the lack of damage, the studied intimacy of the intrusion, were almost always personal. Almost always someone who had been watching for a long time. Someone for whom the intrusion itself was the communication. "What are they communicating?" Petra asked. "That they can," Detective Touraud said. "That's usually enough for them." He set up a surveillance rotation on the house for 2 weeks. Nothing. He contacted Dale Murchison through last-known associates and eventually located him in Gulfport, Mississippi, where he'd been living for over a year and could be placed, by employer records and utility bills, nowhere near Chalmette on any of the relevant dates. Dale Murchison was not the man in Petra's house. Summer arrived. No more incidents. Petra began to wonder, cautiously and against her better judgment, whether it was over. Whether whatever it had been had moved on, found a different focus, lost interest. She slept a little better. She stopped checking the guest bedroom window every night before bed. She told Camille about some of it, toned it down, softened the edges, and Camille said she should move, and Petra said she was considering it, and both of them understood that she would not move because this was her house, and she had never in her life been run out of anything she decided to stay in. On September 14th, at 2:21 in the morning, the motion-activated floodlight in the backyard switched on. Petra was awake. She had been awake for no particular reason, lying in the dark, as people who have been afraid for a long time sometimes find themselves awake in the middle of the night for no particular reason, because the body has a way of holding knowledge that the mind has chosen to set aside. She saw the light through the bedroom curtains. The floodlight cast everything in a cold, bleaching white, and when she crossed to the window and stood to the side and looked out through the gap in the curtains, she saw him. He was standing at the back fence, just standing there, a large man, heavy-set, in dark clothing, facing the house. The light had caught him mid-step, and he had gone absolutely still, the way animals sometimes go still when something unexpected happens. He was perhaps 40 feet from where she stood. She could not see his face. The distance was too great, and the angle of the light cast his face in shadow. They stood like that. She at the window, he at the fence. For 11 seconds she counted them afterward. 11 seconds in which nothing moved and no one breathed, and the floodlight continued its cold, indifferent illumination of everything it could reach. Then the light clicked off. The motion had stopped. The darkness came back all at once, sudden and total, and when Petra scrambled to turn on her phone's flashlight and shine it through the window, there was nothing at the fence. No one. The backyard was empty. She called 911. Officers arrived within 8 minutes. They found no one on the property. They found no footprints near the fence because the ground there was dry and hard. They found, in the soft earth of the flower bed directly below the guest bedroom window, the same flower bed where the single footprint had been found back in March, a pattern, not footprints, something else. Small circular impressions, spaced 6 to 8 inches apart, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate configuration. An officer took photographs. A supervisor was called. Detective Touraud was notified at home. When he arrived the next morning and examined the photographs and the flower bed himself, he was quiet for a long time. He looked at the impressions. He looked at the window above them. He looked at the fence at the back of the yard. Then he said something that Petra would turn over in her mind for years afterward. "He's been counting." She asked what that meant. Touraud said he didn't want to speculate until he'd looked into it further. He had an analyst examine the photographs. The analyst came back with a pattern analysis that noted the impressions were consistent with a single object pressed repeatedly into the soil, the end of a thin cylindrical rod or dowel, and that the spacing and arrangement suggested they were not random. They formed a grid, 11 rows, 11 columns, 121 impressions. Turreau's theory, which he shared with Petra only in outline, was that someone had been marking visits, coming to the window over a period of time and making a record of it, which meant that the incidents Petra had reported, the creaking, the unlocked door, the glass of water, the figure at the fence, were not the sum of what had happened. They were only the ones she had noticed. He had been there many more times than that. Petra sold the house in January. She moved to Metairie, a suburb on the other side of New Orleans. She never heard the creaking again. She never found another footprint or an unlocked door. She never saw another figure at the fence. Detective Turreau's investigation identified a person of interest in October of that year, a man named Corbin Ash, 53, who had lived 3 streets over from Millhaven Road for 6 years and had, neighbors later confirmed, shown a marked interest in Petra's comings and goings. His property was searched. No charges were ever filed, on the advice of the district attorney, due to insufficient physical evidence. Corbin Ash continued to live 3 streets over from Millhaven Road. Petra never returned to that neighborhood. The night nurse who found her, upright in the hospital bed, eyes open, hands folded, with that look of final understanding, found her that way on a Wednesday morning in November of 2022. Petra was 44. She had suffered a stroke in her sleep, significant and fast, the kind that takes most of what a person is and leaves only the arrangement of their body behind. She had not been unwell before that night. She had been healthy and careful and, by every available measure, had made a new life for herself in a place where she felt safe. On the nightstand beside her hospital bed was her phone. The last thing she had looked at, according to the timestamp, was a Google Maps satellite image. The kind where you can zoom in on a street from above and see the rooftops and the yards and the small private geometries of people's lives from a distance. She had zoomed in on Millhaven Road. She had been looking at her old house, and she had moved the image not toward the house but toward the drainage canal behind the fence, beyond the canal, into the dark strip of marsh and scrub that lay beyond the reach of any floodlight she had ever installed, as though, in the end, she had finally understood what he had been watching for, as though she had finally turned to face the same direction. What she saw there, in the dark beyond the canal, will probably never be known. She was alone in that room with her phone, and whatever understanding had arrived in those final hours. Detective Turreau, when he was informed of the circumstances, looked at the satellite image she had been viewing for a long time. He noted the overgrown drainage easement, the dense scrub, the fact that, from that angle, it would be possible, if someone stood exactly where the footprint had been, to watch not the house but the approach from the other side of the canal. As though Corbin Ash had not been focused on Petra at all. As though he had been watching for something else, something that might come through the dark from the other side. Something that, in those final quiet hours, Petra had apparently worked out on her own. And that is the question that nobody left behind her can answer. Not Detective Turreau, not Camille, who speaks of her mother with a grief that is still raw and real and clean. Not any of the neighbors who remember the quiet schoolteacher who used to live on Millhaven Road, and who once, when asked, said she chose that house because it backed up against the canal, and she loved the sound of water at night. What was Corbin Ash watching for? And what does it tell us that in the end Petra was watching for it too? That gap. That cold, silent gap between a man at a fence and the darkness beyond it is the kind of gap that doesn't close just because someone stops looking. It stays open. It stays dark. And somewhere on the other side of it, whatever Corbin Ash spent years waiting for continues, in all likelihood, to be exactly where it has always been. Waiting. Story 2. The thing that smiled back the last photograph Marcus Okafor ever took of himself was on the morning of April 3, 2021. It was a selfie. He sent it to his younger sister, Denise, with the caption, "Haircut good or haircut bad?" and a string of question marks. His hair looked fine. He looked fine. He was standing in the bathroom of the apartment he had been renting for 6 weeks in Spokane, Washington. a place he had moved to after a job transfer, a place where he knew almost nobody, in a state he had never lived in before. He was 32 years old. He was, by every visible measure in that photograph, a healthy and untroubled man, asking his sister whether his haircut looked good. He was dead by midnight. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as acute cardiac arrest. No drugs in his system, no signs of violence, no pre-existing heart condition in his medical history that anyone had identified. A perfectly healthy 32-year-old man whose heart simply stopped in his apartment on a Saturday night in April, for reasons that a team of cardiologists would later describe as idiopathic, which is medical language for we do not know. Denise Okafor flew from Atlanta to Spokane within 24 hours of being notified. She had been the one to receive the last photograph. She had replied, "Haircut looks great, honestly," and then heard nothing for the rest of the day, which she had attributed to Marcus being busy with his weekend, until a neighbor called her because they'd been unable to reach Marcus themselves and had noticed his lights on and his car in the lot all day. The neighbor's name was Fyodor Blatt. He was 60 years old, a retired machinist who had lived in the apartment complex for 9 years, who took a quiet and paternal interest in his neighbors, and who had, in the 6 weeks since Marcus moved in, become something like a friend to him in the uncomplicated way that some older men befriend younger ones who remind them of someone they used to know. Fyodor was the one who called 911. He was the one who waited in the hallway with his hands in his pockets while the paramedics worked and ultimately conceded defeat. And he was the one who, when Denise arrived 2 days later, sat with her in his apartment over bad coffee and told her what he had noticed. He had not told the police. He had not told anyone. Because what he had noticed was not the kind of thing that has a logical explanation, and Fyodor Blatt was a practical man who distrusted things without logical explanations, and so he had kept the information to himself right up until the moment he looked at Denise Okafor across his small kitchen table and decided that she deserved to know. In the final week of Marcus's life, Fyodor had noticed something in the apartment across the hall. Not in Marcus's apartment, in the one directly across from it. Apartment 14B, which had been empty for 4 months. He had noticed a light, not the overhead light, which would have been visible as a bar under the door. This was different. A pale, thin light, like the glow of a phone screen, visible in the narrow gap between the door and the door frame that occurs when a door has settled slightly and no longer seals flush against the jamb. This light appeared in the evenings, always after 11 o'clock, always when the hallway was quiet and Fyodor happened to be going to or returning from the communal laundry room at the end of the corridor. He had noticed it 3 times. The first time he'd assumed the super was in there for maintenance. The second time he'd knocked on the door and gotten no answer. The third time he told the building's super directly, who had told him that nobody had been in 14 billions in weeks, and that was when Fyodor had stopped mentioning it to anyone. Because the super's certainty that the apartment was empty, combined with the evidence of someone inside it, pointed in a direction that Fyodor Blatt didn't know what to do with, and so had chosen, as a practical man, to ignore. But he told Denise. He told her about the light. He told her the dates, March 29th, April 1st and April 2nd, the night before Marcus died. Denise is not her brother. Where Marcus was easy and warm and deflecting, Denise is precise and methodical and a little relentless, which is why she is good at her job, which is forensic accounting. She asked Fyodor to walk her through everything he could remember. She asked about the quality of the light, the height of it in the doorframe. Was it high, as it would be if someone was holding a phone at eye level, or low, as it would be if someone was crouching? He thought about it for a long time and said it was low, knee height, maybe lower. She thanked him and went across the hall and knocked on 14 billions herself. The door swung open. It hadn't been latched. It had been pushed to but not latched, and her knock opened it onto an empty apartment that smelled of dust and carpet cleaner, completely unfurnished, with nothing on the walls and nothing on the floors except, near the far wall, a dark stain on the carpet that was approximately oval in shape and approximately the size of a large dog's bed. Denise stood in the doorway and looked at the stain for a long time. She photographed it. She photographed the door frame and the gap between the door and the jamb. She photographed the floor near the door, where, she noticed, the carpet was fractionally compressed in a pattern, suggesting something had rested there for a sustained period. not footprints. More like the impression left by a large, low, dense object, something that crouched, something that did not have the footprint pattern of anything standing upright. Denise brought what she had to the Spokane Police Department the following morning. A detective named Priya Mehta, calm, thorough, experienced, took her statement and examined the photographs and walked across to the apartment complex and spoke to the building super, and to Fyodor Blatt, and to two other neighbors who, once questioned directly, admitted they had also seen the light in 14 billions on various evenings over the previous 6 weeks. None of them had reported it. For the same reason Fyodor hadn't, it seemed easier to explain than to explain. The dark stain on the carpet of 14 billions was tested. It came back as biological material, specifically a mixture consistent with organic matter and moisture, the kind of compound produced by something living that occupies a space for an extended period. The lab was unable to specify the species or source. The test was inconclusive in the ways that tests sometimes are when the thing being tested doesn't fit neatly into any existing category. No evidence of criminal activity was found, no evidence of unlawful entry. The door lock showed signs of age and wear, not tampering. 14 billions was released 2 months later to a young couple who reported nothing unusual and who still live there today. Marcus Okafor's cause of death remains officially listed as acute cardiac arrest idiopathic. The cardiologist who reviewed his case in detail, a Dr. Nneka Adaeze-Obi, who specializes in unexplained cardiac events in otherwise healthy patients, noted in her assessment that one of the markers present in his blood work, a stress hormone cluster associated with sustained and extreme fear response, was elevated to a level she described as consistent with a prolonged state of terror. Not a single incident of terror, a prolonged state, something that had been building for days or weeks. He was very afraid of something, Dr. Adaeze-Obi told Denise. For a considerable period before he died, he just didn't tell anyone. Denise thought about the last photograph. Her brother in the bathroom mirror, hair freshly cut, sending a silly question into the ordinary morning light of a spring day. She thought about the fact that this was the same person who had been living for 6 weeks across the hall from a dark and empty apartment where something crouched by the door in the night. He must have known it was there. He must have heard it, or sensed it, or caught the faint glow under the door when he came home late and stood in the hallway with his key in his hand. He was not a man who talked easily about fear. He was a man who sent selfies about haircuts, and made coffee for his 60-year-old neighbor, and said things like, "I'm good," when people asked him how he was adjusting to his new city. He would not have said anything, not until he understood it, and he never got the chance to understand it. "Did he ever seem afraid to you?" Denise asked Fyodor Blatt near the end of their conversation. "In those 6 weeks, did he ever seem like he was scared?" Fyodor thought about this very carefully, the way a person thinks about something they've been trying not to think about. "Once," he said, "about 10 days before, I passed him in the hallway at night, coming back from laundry. He didn't hear me coming. When I said his name, he went completely white, like I had come out of the wall." Fyodor paused, and then he laughed it off. "You know how young men do." He made a joke, but his hands were shaking for the rest of the conversation. "Which direction had he been looking?" Denise asked, "when you startled him?" Fyodor didn't need to think about that one. "Across the hall," he said quietly. "He was looking at 14 billions. Denise Okafor still lives in Atlanta. She still works in forensic accounting. She flies to Spokane once a year, on the anniversary of Marcus's death, though she has never been able to fully articulate why. She doesn't visit the apartment complex. She doesn't visit the cemetery. She just goes to Spokane, and she walks around the city that her brother was learning to live in. And she thinks about what it means to be afraid of something you cannot name and cannot see clearly and cannot explain to anyone in a way that won't make them look at you with that particular expression people reserve for things they don't want to believe. She does not know what was in 14 billions. Nobody knows. There is a version of this story in which the answer is entirely mundane. A squatter, an animal, a trick of the light, and the grief of a sister trying to make meaning out of a meaningless loss. There is another version in which something found Marcus Okafor in a city where he knew almost nobody, and watched him from across the hall until his body could not sustain the accumulated weight of knowing it was there. The honest answer is that both versions are possible. And the honest answer is that living in the space between two possible versions of a terrible thing is its own specific kind of darkness. It is in fact the kind of darkness that most of us will never have to inhabit. Marcus Okafor lived in it for 6 weeks, and he did it alone, and he sent a selfie about his haircut. Story 3. What the water remembered the town of Crestfall. Idaho does not appear on most maps. It is the kind of place that got its name from a geological feature, a narrow falls in the Salmon River tributary that runs through a cleft in the canyon rock about 2 miles north of town, and has been slowly declining since the timber industry retreated in the 1990s and took the population with it. In 2023, according to county records, Crestfall had a population of 211 people. It had a post office, a diner, a gas station, a volunteer fire department, and a gravel road that wound up into the hills and divided into 2 tracks that went to the few remaining occupied properties on the high ridgeline above the river. Isolde Pruitt moved to Crestfall in August of 2023. She was 37. She had been a pharmacist in Boise, had left that job and that city and that version of her life following a breakdown that she described as comprehensive, her word, in which she had lost, in the space of 8 months, her marriage, her mother, and her ability to walk into her own pharmacy without feeling like the walls were actively pressing inward. She bought a property on the Ridgeline Road for $60,000. 3 acres, a 2-bedroom house in reasonable condition, well water, a wood stove, and a view of the canyon that, on clear days, extended to a horizon she described as the most honest thing she had ever seen. She chose Crestfall for a reason she couldn't entirely explain. She had driven through it once, years earlier, on a road trip with her ex-husband. She remembered the falls. She remembered the sound of it through the open car window. Not a roar, but a continuous low murmur, almost like speech. And she had thought at the time that this was a sound a person could organize their life around. It had stayed with her the way certain sounds do, present at the edge of things, surfacing at quiet moments. She did not know when she moved to Crestfall about the reservoir. There is a reservoir 12 miles upstream from Crestfall, created in 1961 by a dam that the federal government no longer maintains. The reservoir flooded a small valley that had, at the time of flooding, 2 things in it: a stand of old-growth cedar that the timber company wanted gone, and a homestead community called Haller's Bend, population 40, which had been told it would be compensated for relocation and received, by the accounts of those who survived long enough to say so, something considerably less than that. Haller's Bend went under the water. The cedar went under the water. The few residents who hadn't yet left went on to make lives elsewhere. The dam went into disrepair in the 1980s, was patched twice, and by 2023 was the subject of an ongoing federal maintenance dispute that had been in some stage of bureaucratic resolution for over a decade. Isolde didn't know any of this when she moved to the ridge. She found out about the dam situation 6 weeks in, when a county inspector appeared at her property to tell her that as a downstream property owner, she was on a notification list and would receive advance warning of any controlled release events, which were routine. She thanked him and went back inside and looked up the reservoir on Haller's Bend and read about the flooded valley for about an hour. She noted it the way she noted everything that didn't seem immediately relevant, carefully, and without deciding yet what to do with it. She was still learning the sound of the place. The falls at night were exactly as she remembered, low, continuous, almost vocal. In the first weeks, she sometimes woke in the small hours and lay still and listened to it, and found that it was, as she had hoped, a sound that organized things. It pushed back the interior noise of a mind that had spent 8 months in crisis. It was good medicine. It was, in the clinical sense, working. In October, she began hearing something else. At first, she thought it was the wind. The ridge caught wind badly, and the sound it made through the canyon was complex and variable. Sometimes a whistle, sometimes a bass moan, sometimes a percussive knocking as it moved the dead branches of the ponderosa pines along the road. But the new sound was not any of those. It was, and she was a precise woman, trained in precision, and she chose her words deliberately. It was conversational. Not words, not in any sense that she was willing to claim without qualification, but the rhythm of it, the cadence. The way it rose and fell and paused and rose again. It had the shape of language without the content of it. It came from the direction of the river, lower in the canyon, and it came specifically at night, and specifically in the small hours, and specifically, she eventually noted in the journal she had started keeping, on nights when the water level in the river seemed higher than usual. She mentioned it to a woman named Cass Delacroix at the diner in town. Cass was 72, had been born in Crestfall, and had a way of receiving information without reacting to it that Isolde had come to find deeply reassuring. Cass listened to the description of the sound. She drank her coffee. She looked out the window at the main road. "That'll be the water talking," Cass said. Isolde waited for more. "People who've lived here their whole lives, they know not to go down to the river when it's talking," Cass said. "I don't know what it is, never asked. My father used to say the water remembers what it covered, and some nights it tries to say it back." Isolde went home and stood on her porch and looked down into the canyon for a long time. In November, she went down to the river. She told herself she was a pharmacist. She told herself she was a woman of science and clinical precision who had no patience for folklore dressed up as advice. She told herself that the sound was almost certainly a geological phenomenon, a resonance effect, perhaps, created by the particular shape of the canyon and the volume of water and the acoustic qualities of the rock walls, and that the only way to demystify it was to look at it directly. She went down to the river at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, with a headlamp and boots and a walking stick she'd cut from a pine branch. The path down to the river from the ridge road was steep and rocky, and twice she had to catch herself on the walking stick. But she made it. She stood at the bank, and the river was higher than she'd seen it before, dark and fast and present in a way that made the air around it feel charged. And the sound, yes, it was there, exactly as she'd described it, rising from the water itself, or from some confluence of water and rock and air that produced it. She stood and listened for a long time. She was not afraid. She was, she later wrote in her journal, fascinated. The sound moved around rhythmic phrases that her brain kept trying to resolve into meaning, the way the brain tries to resolve ambiguous images into familiar shapes. It was not language, she was certain of that. But it had learned something from language, the way rivers eventually learn the shapes of the things in their path. Then the headlamp flickered. It didn't die. It flickered twice and stayed on. But in those 2 brief intervals of darkness, standing at the river's edge with the sound of the water all around her, Isolde saw something in the water. Or she believed she did. She wrote about it in her journal, in careful, measured terms, the way a scientist records an observation she cannot yet explain. She wrote that in the brief darkness before the headlamp recovered, she saw, or seemed to see, luminescence in the water. Not reflected light, not bioluminescence in any conventional sense, something deeper, as though the light was coming from below the surface, from the bottom of the river, from somewhere beneath the rocks. And in that light, the barest outline of something. Not a face. She was explicit about this in her journal. Not a face, but a shape that, like the sound, had learned something from faces, that had the suggestion of a face the way a river learns the shape of a stone. The headlamp steadied, and the river was dark, and she was standing alone at 2 in the morning with cold water over the toes of her boots, and she went back up the ridge very quickly, and she did not go back down to the river at night again. Dr. Rajesh Patel, a neurologist she had been consulting remotely for her ongoing recovery, told her when she described the experience that visual phenomena of this kind, the perception of pattern and structure in low-light ambiguous visual fields, were entirely consistent with a brain under the specific kind of stress her brain had been under. That the mind, he said, is an aggressive pattern finder, especially when depleted, especially in environments that are sensory-rich and unfamiliar. He said this not dismissively, but as information she deserved to have. She thanked him and kept the information. And she kept the journal. She kept recording the nights when the sound came from the river. She kept noting the correlation with water level. She looked up everything she could find about Haller's Bend, and she found, in a county historical archive, a photograph from 1960, 1 year before the flooding. A small group of people standing at the edge of a river that she recognized as the same river she could see from her porch. Behind them, a stand of cedar trees, and at the far right of the photograph, barely in frame, a child. A small child facing the water, with their back to the camera, in a posture that Isolde recognized not because she had seen it before, but because it was the posture of someone listening very carefully to something that was not yet saying what they most needed to hear. Isolde Pruitt still lives on the ridge above Crestfall. She has rebuilt a version of herself there that is quieter and more durable than the previous version, and that is, she says, the best thing she has managed in 40 years of living. She no longer goes down to the river at night. Not because she is afraid of what she might find there, but because she made a decision after that November night that there are some questions you can ask only so many times before you become the answer. The dam upstream is still under federal review. The reservoir is still there, and the water that runs through the canyon at Crestfall is still the same water that covered Holler's Bend in 1961. Same molecules, same cold, same accumulated memory of what it was before the valley went under. It has had 60 years to learn the weight of what it holds. There are nights, Castellacqua says, when it speaks more clearly than others. There are nights when the people on the ridge keep their lights on until morning. There are nights when the river sounds like it is trying very hard to remember a name. Story 4. The shift supervisor at the Hartwell Industrial Park in Gary, Indiana. The overnight shift at Meridian Cold Storage runs from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. It is not glamorous work. It is not varied work. It is work that takes place inside a warehouse maintained at 8 degrees Fahrenheit, where the people who do it wear insulated suits and move pallets and monitor temperature logs and exist for 8 hours in a world of aluminum racking and fluorescent lights and the constant low hum of refrigeration units that never fully resolves into silence. Nasreen Khalil was the overnight shift supervisor at Meridian Cold Storage for 4 years, beginning in 2018. She was 30 years old when she started. Meticulous, competent, the kind of supervisor that workers either love or find slightly unnerving depending on their relationship with accountability. She ran a tight shift. She kept thorough logs. She had not lost a single pallet to temperature deviation in 4 years, which was the record she was quietly most proud of. She was also, from approximately September of 2020, the only person on her 6-person overnight crew who had noticed that there were sometimes 7 people on the floor. The first time, she had thought it was a miscommunication, someone from the day shift lingering, or a new hire nobody had introduced her to, or a maintenance contractor who'd come in through the loading dock after hours. A figure moving between the racking units, in the standard issue insulated white coveralls everyone wore on the floor, far enough from her position that she couldn't see the face, close enough that she was certain it was a person and not a trick of the light. She had counted her 6 and found all 6 accounted for, and looked back to where she'd seen the figure and found nothing. The second time, she did what a thorough supervisor does. She counted heads, 6 on the floor in addition to herself. The figure near the back racking, visible in the gap between 2 ceiling-high aluminum shelves, was a 7th. She walked toward it. The 7th figure stepped, unhurriedly, not fleeing, almost casually, behind the racking unit, and when she reached the spot there was no one there. The aisle behind the racking was a dead end. There was nowhere to go. The insulated suit she thought she'd seen was not there. There was no warmth in the air that an additional body at 8 degrees Fahrenheit would have introduced. She went back to her position and logged the time, 3:15 a.m., and wrote in the maintenance request log that she needed to speak to management about unauthorized access to the floor. The third time she saw the 7th figure, she pulled up the security footage during her break. The system kept 48 hours of footage. She reviewed the portion from 3 to 3:30 a.m. She found herself on camera, walking from her station toward the back racking. She found her 6 crew members in their positions. She did not find the 7th figure. The aisle where she'd seen it was in full camera coverage. It was empty except for the racking and the frozen product and the cold that the cameras could not show, but that she could feel in her bones for the rest of the shift. She did not tell her crew. She did not know at that point whether what she was seeing was a symptom of something wrong with her own perception. The 4 years of overnight shifts, the cold, the monotony, the particular way the fluorescent lights cast shadows between the racks at specific times of night, or something else. She told one person, A man named Terrence Buckley, 55, the warehouse's facilities manager, who had worked at Meridian for 20 years and who Nasreen trusted precisely because he was immune to drama. He listened to her account without expression. He asked her to describe the figure. She said, insulated white coveralls, average height, no visible identifying features, moved with a specific quality of movement that she found difficult to articulate, except to say that it moved as though it was familiar with the space, as though it had every right to be there. Terrence was quiet for a moment. "This is the third time?" he said. "Third time I've seen it," she said. "I don't know how many other times it might have been there." Terrence looked at his coffee cup. "You ever check the old logs?" he said. "Before your time." She had not. She checked them that week. Meridian Cold Storage had been operating at the Hartwell Industrial Park since 1997. The incident logs documented equipment failures, security incidents, personnel matters, ran to 11 binders in the office filing cabinet. Nasreen went through them over 3 evenings, reading the handwritten entries of 3 supervisors before her. She found what she was looking for on the 27th evening review of 2009, a note in the handwriting of a shift supervisor named G. Petrova, which read, "Third incident this month. 7th person on floor, does not appear on camera. 0 response to verbal contact, gone before I can reach position. Logging for record." Below it, someone else had written in different ink, in different handwriting. G. Building management says, old foreman Ruiz died on floor 2004. Wasn't found for 6 hours. Cold does strange things to carbon. Don't log further. Crew morale. Nasreen read this entry 4 times. She thought about what it meant. She thought about what old foreman Ruiz implied and what carbon meant in this context. A clinical word for a human body. The carbon that makes us up and that, in the right circumstances and the wrong temperatures, does not behave the way we expect it to. She thought about what "don't log further" implied about the number of times this had happened before 2009. She went to Terrence the next day. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. Terrence looked at her for a long time. Before G. Petrova, there was a supervisor named Webb. Before Webb, there was Supervisor Danqua. You want to know what all 3 of them have in common? Tell me. All 3 of them transferred out within a year of starting to see the figure, Terrence said. None of them told management why. All of them logged it once and then stopped logging it, same as Petrova. And all of them, all 3, said some version of the same thing on their way out the door. That whoever it was wasn't causing any harm. That it seemed to just be checking on things, like it was still doing the job. Nasreen thought about a man named Ruiz who had died on the floor in 2004 and had not been found for 6 hours. She thought about what 6 hours in 8 degrees Fahrenheit, alone on the floor of a warehouse in the small dead hours of an overnight shift, is like. She thought about a person who had spent years being thorough and meticulous and proud of their logs, dying alone in a cold room where their job had been to make sure everything was exactly right. She thought about what it would mean to still be there, still checking, still doing the job. Nasreen Khalil requested a transfer in February of 2022. She did not cite the reason. She moved to a warehouse management role in the Chicago region, a day shift position, and she has not worked nights since. She was thorough and methodical and correct about the 7th figure the whole time, and she never once felt that it meant her harm. And that is the part of the story she finds most difficult to explain to people. Not the fear, the lack of it. "It wasn't frightening," she said once to a former colleague who asked her why she really transferred. "It was sad, like watching someone who doesn't know they can stop." She paused. "I hope eventually they figure that out," she said. "I hope whoever he was, I hope eventually somebody tells him it's okay to go." Closing reflection: 4 stories. 4 ordinary Americans in ordinary American places. A house on a Louisiana canal road, an apartment hallway in a Pacific Northwest city, a canyon ridge in Idaho, a refrigerated warehouse in Gary, Indiana. 4 people who woke up one morning in a life that made sense and went to sleep in a life that had acquired something new in it. A doubt, a question, a presence they couldn't name. None of them were especially reckless. None of them were especially unlucky. They simply lived in places that turned out to have more in them than any reasonable map had suggested. The teacher and the canal, The brother and the dark apartment, the pharmacist and the river's memory, the supervisor and the figure that wouldn't stop working. What do you do with that? When the place you thought you knew turns out to be keeping a secret? When the sound of ordinary water starts to sound like something trying to say a name? When the light in the empty room doesn't have an explanation that you can file under something manageable and close the drawer? Most people do what people do. They tell themselves a version of the story that fits in a category they already have. They call it settling. They call it stress. They call it the brain's well-documented tendency to find pattern in noise. They call it grief or anxiety or too many nights alone or not enough sunlight. And sometimes that's exactly what it is. Sometimes the most honest explanation is the most mundane one. But sometimes it isn't. And the people who have to live with the version that isn't, who have to wake up every morning in the house above the canal, or walk past the door of apartment 14B, or stand on the ridge above the talking river, or count to 7 when 6 is what the roster says. Those people develop a specific kind of knowledge that is not available any other way. Knowledge that the world is larger than the category system we've built for it. Knowledge that the gap between what we know and what is actually there is not empty. It is occupied. By something, by someone, by the accumulated weight of everything that happened in a place before you arrived and will keep happening after you leave. That gap is where we live, most of us, for most of our lives. Close enough to the edge of the strange, dark and mysterious to feel it, far enough from it that we can pretend we don't. The people in these stories stepped a little closer, and what they found there, in the dark beyond the canal, in the cold apartment across the hall, in the river that remembers a flooded valley, in the frozen warehouse at 3 in the morning, is not something that can be fully said in words, but it can be felt, even now, especially now, right at the edge.